we are jumping back into quilting for this demo, and I'm going to show you how to make this super cute little block. We're going to make it finishes at 6 inches, but right here where you have the individual block by itself, if you're a quilter, you know how this works. Before the seam allowances get taken up and have this sewn into a project, it measures 6.5 by 6.5. So we are going to make this little quilt block a plus sign quilt block. I'm going to walk you through step by step from cutting, prepping the fabrics, my tips for sewing and cutting accurately, my favorite ruler, all this kind of stuff that I use to cut up and make this super cute little patchwork block, okay? So I think technology's on our side today for now. I'm looking at the chat to let's say hi to some friends. And if you can see me and hear me, let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from. Let's see. Hey, Margie, tuning in from Wisconsin. Muriel is tuning in from Florida. We have Patricia in the house from Arizona. Doris from Texas. Gisela is on from Sweden. Hey, Gisela. All right. Hey, Ruby. And, ooh, Alex tuning in from Claremont, Florida, which is a couple hours south of us. And Mary from Nova Scotia. She says it's dreary up there. It's dreary here too, except it's probably not as cold as it is in Nova Scotia. Let me get a sip of water here. All right. So it looks like everybody can see me and hear me fine. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to, let's swap over to the over the shoulder shot here. And then I've provided y'all with a free PDF download. It's one sheet so that you can make this little plus sign block in 3 different sizes. And the link for that, if you're watching on YouTube, is in the video description box below, just so you know. It looks like this, and you can print it out. We have this little diagram that we're also going to go ahead and put up on the screen for you so that I can walk you through as I cut each of the individual components. And that way you can choose the fabrics that you want to feature in each of those different spots, okay? So this is the little block that we're going to be making, and I'm going to make this new one out of these 2 fabrics. I'm just going to use 2 fabrics, and I love high contrast. I'm not really big on like color theory and whether or not, you know, one color is on the opposite side of the color wheel and all that stuff. I simply look to see that the 2 fabrics that I'm choosing to use, if I can look at them and instantly tell which one is playing as the dark and which one is playing as the light, then I know that I have enough contrast there, and that is visually appealing, at least to me. So if I look at these 2 fabrics, I know that this light gray one is my light, and this bright blue one with polka dots is my dark. So once I can see that really quickly, I know that regardless of whether I use the blue fabric for the background of the block and the gray for the inside, or vice versa, then I'm still going to have enough visual contrast where the plus sign is going to pop out of the center of that quilt block. All right, so let's get started. First, we're going to talk a little bit about fabric prep. And if you've made quilt blocks before or quilts, you know that there are 2 schools of thought when it comes to starching. And I have some heavy finish Niagara spray here. That's just what I had left over from my old shop. So we're going to go ahead and starch it. Now, I am a starcher. Regardless of the starch, I really like my fabric to be nice and stiff for precision quilting. Not everybody feels the same way. Some of you might just pre-wash and dry your fabrics and just give it a nice press so it has no wrinkles, but it doesn't make it as crisp as if I use a starch, right? And I like it to be crisp. If you ever started off sewing, maybe on paper or cardstock, I oftentimes will start young children sewing through paper like that because the fabric is not as, or excuse me, the paper is not as fluid as fabric, so it's not going to move too much on them. Or sometimes I have kids that like want to try and hold the fabrics together, and with paper they don't have to do that, and so they don't run the risk of getting their fingers too close to that needle either. So I like to sew my patchwork pieces, especially the smaller they are, the crisper I like it to be. Don't come for me because I know some of you are like, no way, no starch. So let me know in the comments, are you a starcher or not? And sometimes if I have a starch that's not really stiff, I literally will like spray, dry it, spray again, dry it, and just build up the layers of starch. But this feels pretty good to me for quilting, for like a quilt block, okay? I'm gonna do the same thing to my other chunk. And as you can see, this block is gonna be great for using up scrap fabrics. It makes a great scrappy quilt. You can even just make maybe 9 of these and put them together into a big square and use it as a little mini quilt to decorate your sewing space, okay? So we're starching this, and then we're going to start cutting. Now let's go ahead and get the little diagram up on the screen for them so they can start kind of wrapping their heads around what we're making here and like what the pieces are. So it's a simple little block, but you can see everywhere you see a letter there, A, B, C, and D are going to be different fabric cuts that we need to make. So we'll need to either label them if you're going to be making a ton of them for an actual bigger quilt project, or you can just set them up into little stacks, okay? Kathy says the starch always messes up my iron. That's interesting. I wonder what kind of starch does that, or maybe what the material is for the sole plate of your iron. I see a bunch of you are like, starch please, starcher. I see you. Okay, these are my people right there. Starch all day. Susie says vodka starch. I know some people make their own. I've yet to venture out and make my own, but I need to do that, really. I keep saying I've been going to do it for years, and I just never buy the vodka. All right, so we're going to start off cutting the background. So I'm going to use gray for the background of the block. Where you see this pale green here, it's going to be gray for this new block that we're working on. So those are units A, if we're looking at the diagram. And for a size 6-inch finished block, which is the same as this one, you can see we're not going to use up that much fabric. I need to cut out 4 squares that measure 2 3/4 square. So here are my handy dandy rulers. These are my rulers that I designed. They're made here in the US, and it's the Crafty Gemini 5x10-inch ruler. So I like this ruler, and I designed it for this purpose, to help me locate what I call the 0 point on the bottom right of my ruler here. I have this big black dot, and that tells me where the 1 and 1 are. This 0 corner, this whole area here, is basically the only corner of the 4 corners on any ruler that the numbers and the measurements increase from here, right? If you've ever looked at any rectangular or square ruler, you know, like if we look here, this one says a 1 and a 4, meaning 1, 2, 3, the numbers go up this way, but the numbers are counting down from the width of the fabric. So it's 4, 3, 2, 1. I don't ever want to use a ruler that requires me to be like 3 inches. I'm at the number 5. 5 minus 3 is 2. You are very easily going to make mistakes if you have to do that, especially if we're not cutting whole inch increment cuts, okay? So what my ruler helps me do is I position it where I want it. First, let's go ahead and trim off this, because this was a scrap piece, so it's not exactly straight. So I'm going to trim off just a sliver here to straighten off this cut, okay? And so now this edge is nice and straight for me. So I said I need to cut out 4 squares that measure 2 3/4. So what this dot allows me to do is to quickly place it so that it's right here on the bottom right-hand corner. And I'm going to take the 2 3/4 inch line of the ruler and place it on the cut edge. So I don't have to measure backwards, 5 minus 2 3/4 or anything like that. I simply go to 2 3/4 and I make sure that that line is aligned with the cut edge. Now, some of the lines that you'll see on my ruler here, they're dashed. And so if you've ever had a ruler where the lines are really thick and dark, you know in quilting, we need to be precise. So if I'm aligning my fabric edge on a solid, thick line, it's tricky to see where exactly the fabric is because the line is solid and you can't see through it. So what I designed this ruler is to have a different length of dashed lines for the different 1/4 inch increments. And that way, in the little spaces of the dashes, we can see the fabric peeking through. And that way, I make sure that it's a super accurate measurement and cut. All right, so that's 2 3/4. And I'm going to cut there. I'm going to go ahead and cut another one just because I'm not sure if I can get all 4 of the squares from that strip. So again, I measured 2 3/4, and then I know that exactly what is underneath the ruler up to that line is my 2 3/4. So I'm right hand dominant, and I will just cut along the right side edge of that strip. Okay, now let's go ahead and subcut these down. They need to be cut down to 2 3/4, same measurement. So again, still with that dot on my bottom right hand corner, I just place this edge now on 2 3/4. And that's the dashed line right before the big old 3 that I can see right there. And I'm going to cut 1. Obviously, if you were doing this with a longer strip and you were making multiples of these for a larger quilt project, you would cut a whole strip, keep it folded, and you know, obviously cut out a lot more squares that are the same measurement at the exact same time. But just so that you all can see how I'm doing this. All right, next one. This edge looks straight. And the same thing, and I'm going to cut 1 more. 2 3/4. quarters. And then I can also just make sure I'm 2 3/4 and I'm looking up this way because I have that dot on the bottom right hand corner. Remember I said the measurements go up from there. So the same way that the measurements increase this way, they also increase up. So if I'm trying to cut out a perfect 2 3/4 inch square, I see that 2 3/4 is here and I can just real easily, not having to do any math, just look up and see, okay, I had cut the initial strip correctly too, because what I have under my ruler here is a perfect 2 3/4 inch square, okay? Now, if you don't yet have my ruler, we sell it in the online shop. The link is in the chat and obviously in the video description box. All right, so these are my 4 squares for A. Let's go ahead and set those aside. Moving on to B, and if we're looking at the diagram, B is still made up of the gray fabric. I need to cut out 4 of them that measure 1.5 by 2. Well, this strip was cut to 2 3/4, so why not make the most of it, right? I'm just gonna cut it down to 2 inches. And I'm doing the same thing. I'm just placing the 2-inch line. And my 1-inch increment lines on this ruler are solid, but they're really fine. So they don't block you from seeing the edge of the fabric. And if you're super precise and you have a lot of rulers, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So 2 inches that way. And now we're going to subcut it to get at 4 that measure 1.5. So now same thing. I'm still with the dot on the bottom right corner. And I'm just going to 1.5, which is more spaced out dashed lines on my ruler. So I can easily tell if I mess up a cut. After you make a couple, you know, maybe sometimes you make 5 or 6 cuts. And then you go to make another one and then you just the measurement gets away from you and then you realize you've cut 5 new additional pieces at the wrong measurement. So if you kind of memorize which dash line you're looking at for 1.5, it stands to pop out in your mind when you measure against a different line, especially after you've seen the correct one for several cuts. All right, so I said 4. Yep, 4 at 1.5 by 2, and I'm just making sure everything looks good. You see? And I was able to get all 4 out of that one. All right, so we have A, we have B. Let's move on to C. Now, C and D are going to be whatever the plus sign fabric is. And those of you that are just tuning in, this is the little plus sign block that we're going to be making. Oh, Jackie says, oh, I want your ruler. We put the link in the chat for you, and you can get it in our online shop. This is my 5-inch by 10-inch ruler. It's great for making your own 5-inch squares or subcutting down 10-inch by 10-inch pre-cut squares of fabric into smaller squares and stuff like that. Okay. Let's see. Yes, Susie says, oh, for the vodka starch. She says 1 part vodka to 4 parts water. Use the cheapest vodka because it has the most starch. Great tip. If anybody else tries it, let me know how it goes. Okay, let's see. Yes, Marilyn says, I guess us lefties are going to have to turn the ruler upside down. Yes, you can still use it. Just turn it the other way for you, okay? But that way, with the big black dot right there, you can easily see where that 0 corner is. So wherever you need to orient that to know that the measurements are climbing up in this direction and also in this direction, that's where you place it. It saves you a lot of time instead of having to be like, is it this one, this one? No, it's not this one. Oh, it's this one. So I went ahead and designed it with that dot so you can quickly catch your eye and know how to orient it. Okay. All right, so let's move on. Units C and D. I'm going to get my little guys off of here. So C, we need to just cut 2 at 1 3/4 by 2. And then unit D also has a 2-inch measurement in there, but it's by 4.5. So what I'm going to do is fold this up. Let's clean off the edge. And when I'm folding it like this, you can see what happens. After I've starched it, it's nice and stiff, okay? I mean, it's still drapey because it's quilting cotton, you know, as drapey as quilting cotton can be, right? It's like medium weight cotton, but it does hang. And so instead of forcing this edge to match up, like messing it like that, I'm gonna let the fabric fall where it wants to so that everything is nice and straight. And so then this fold I know is gonna be straight, and I'll use that to measure, okay? I'm placing any straight line on my ruler on the fold, and then I'm scooting it all the way over this way so that I don't waste a lot of fabric, and I just need to shave a little bit of fabric off of this side to clean up that edge because I had ripped the fabric earlier to cut out a chunk from a bigger piece of yardage. Okay, so now we can do 2 rulers, or you can flip this over. You can rotate it like this if you have a rotating cutting mat. This is my Martelli roundabout mat, where I think we only have like 2 or 3 left in stock, and then we'll restock them obviously if they sell out. But this is a cutting mat that rotates on top, and then you can take this off and still work in the same place. And this is the pressing mat. So you'll see me use that after we start sewing so that I can press my seams and all that. Okay, so let's go ahead. We'll just, since I turned the mat, let's go ahead and cut from here. I'm going to cut 2 inches, since I know both of those measurements needed a 2-inch cut. So 2 inches, and again, you saw what I did. I don't even have to think about it. I go here, I put the 2-inch line, and then I just cut. And I can look at it directly from that 0 corner where my measurements start going up from that corner. Okay. Oh, Jennifer says, I love that. I didn't know what the black dot was for. She says, LOL, and she has the ruler. Well, now you know, Jen. Awesome. Okay, so that was 2 inches. Let's go ahead and cut C, because those are kind of small. 1 3/4. So I have selvage edge here. I'm just gonna, again, line up any straight line on my ruler along the bottom edge so that I can ensure that the ruler is going to be straight, because if it's straight here, it's going to be straight here, right? And so again, those dashed lines on the ruler really come in handy, because I can see in between the dashes to make sure that I have it placed or positioned correctly right on that bottom straight edge. Okay, so now let's go ahead, let's cut both of them at the same time. So I'm gonna, well, maybe not, because I just trimmed off the selvage. Ooh, and I still have a little selvage left. We don't want those selvage edges in our project, so let's shave off a little more. Okay, so now let's go ahead and subcut this to 1 3/4. 1 3/4 line, and I can look and see it's 1 3/4 by 2. Double check my list. That's exactly what I need, and I just need 2 of those. So 1, so cute, and 2. Okay, those are C. If we're looking at the diagram, we've cut out A, B, and C pieces. Now I just need 1 strip for D. And D is 2 inches, which I already have, by 4.5. So same thing. Because this ruler measures 5 by 10, obviously I have enough to get 4.5 from here. And I'll just place the 4.5-inch dashed line on the edge where I just cut the previous patchwork chunks out of, and that's it. So now I can see what is underneath my ruler. That's what I always want to make sure of. What I'm trying to keep, the piece I need for my project, should be underneath my ruler. So if I look, I go up to 2 and 4.5. That little rectangle that's underneath my ruler right now measures 2 by 4.5, and that's exactly the piece I need. So let's make the cut. And that's it. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, I'm going to move this, because these lines on this mat sometimes can get a little bit annoying to try and see things underneath it. So if we lay out the pieces, of course, it's not going to be perfect because we haven't sewn the pieces together yet. But just so you can see and make sure that you have the correct pieces that you need, these are our 4 corners, A, right? Then we still have background pieces, B, 1 on each side. Okay, good deal. So like that. And then you can see that we have a little space here in the middle. We're going to put D, which goes here, and then C. I love little pieces. Aren't they cute? So this, once it's sewn together, is going to make up our little plus sign block. All right, so let's move on. Let me just make sure I'm not missing anything here. Okay, so this is what we need to sew. Now, when you're putting together blocks like this, and if we're looking at the diagram, you can see that A is a big square, same size on all 4 corners, but then B and C equal, the height of them together after they're sewn equals the same height of A, right? So basically, I'm pointing that out to say, I can't just grab A and sew B to it by itself, right? Because then I'm only gonna have a partial seam. And then you're not going to go back in and sew this one to it, because then it's going to be off and these two will not be sewn together. So if you've never tried to do this before, like worked with patchwork blocks like this, you need to look at it in separate rows. It can be columns or rows. In this case, we're going to have a look at this one in rows, okay? If this is the top row of my block, I know this is the same as this. And these two have to be together to then equal the same height as this and this. So that tells me the first step here is to sew the little guys together first to make one piece, one block that measures the same height as the other two, and then 1, 2 units and 3 units will come together seamlessly. All right, so that's what we're gonna do first. We're gonna sew these guys together. Now, one of the things about starching my fabrics is that I don't use pins. On a block like this, and even a bigger block, I don't have to use pins because the fabrics don't flop around on me. They stay just fine. And the pieces are typically small enough for these types of quilt blocks that I can just grab it, go straight to the machine, press, and keep it moving, okay? Evie is asking, is that a Martelli mat or board? She's saying, yes, it is. This is the roundabout. Remember I said this comes on top as the cutting mat. Then you take the top off and you have your pressing surface underneath, okay? So here's the block that we're making. And this have to be sewn together first, and then they will equal the same height as the corner blocks, all right? So let's do that. These two little guys. I'm gonna move this out the way, and let's talk a little bit about 1/4 inch seams. And those of you that have this Juki sewing machine, which we sell, we have recently restocked them, so I think we still have a couple left. They usually sell out really fast. I want to tell you, so you can see here, if the needle, once we turn the machine on, at least on this machine, the needle position defaults to 3.5, which just means it's the center of the presser foot, okay? If we want to sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance, or scant 1/4 inch, we need to move the needle closer to the right, because from the edge of the foot right now to where the needle is gonna come down is 3/8 of an inch. And that's too big. We can't have that here, okay? I'm gonna sew a scant 1/4 inch, and so my setting on this machine, I usually dabble between 5 and 5.5, and that just means it's how far over it is. But that little block I did came out perfect, and I had set it to 5. And that's just, again, the needle position. When it comes to the stitch length, for piecing, I want this to hold up through washing, drying, through maybe it's a baby quilt, somebody's going to be, you know, yanking on it, dragging it across the ground and stuff like that. You want that stitch length to be shorter so it holds the pieces together tighter, okay? All right, so I'm starting at the top. I made sure that both of my fabric layers are one on top of the other. If you're off at all by, 2 hairs, it's going to affect the finished quilt block size. So quilting, precision work, okay? I'm not gonna backstitch. When the pieces are that small, I don't want my machine to eat it up. I don't want the thread to build up too much on the edge of a small patchwork piece. So I'm just gonna start sewing. And I'm following the edge. The right side edge of my presser foot is aligned exactly with the edge of my fabric. Now remember, when you're sewing, to sew straight seams and accurate seams, follow the guide. In my case, it's the presser foot. Do not look at the needle. Do not look at the needle. Again, do not look at the needle. The needle's going up and down, and it's one of the most common beginner mistakes. When I teach kids, when I teach adults that are new, everybody's like looking at the needle. Well, what happens is when you look at the needle, you're not looking at the fabric. So your hands start to go like this. The machine's pulling the fabric one way. You need to look at the fabric. If you feed the fabric layers through straight, the machine's gonna sew straight because the needle is only going up and down, okay? So I put the first ones in. I'm gonna go ahead and do the other C and B unit that you can see is underneath that middle D block piece. Again, I don't even need a pin. The fabric stays together. Cotton on cotton tends to hold. Plus the fabric was starched, so it really stays nicely together. So I'm just gonna keep feeding the next one in. Chain piecing is what we call this in quilting, okay? So I sewed up B and C and the other unit of B and C, okay? Now, if we look at what we have left here, remember I talked about sewing these together? Well, the unit that goes here, I've just sewn. The unit that goes here, I've just sewn. So the next one I'm gonna put together is this middle strip. So remember, we're taking this kind of like 3 rows. One row that's gonna be pieced together, this middle row, and then the bottom row is identical to the top one. So let's go ahead and add this background chunk to this side of this middle rectangle, and then the other one to the other side. So I don't have to stop and cut my threads at all yet. I'm just going to grab this middle piece, pretty sides touching, raw edges aligned. I'm going to feed this one in, and then I'm going to cut my threads because I got to connect it to the other side. All right. So this is the middle one. Let me grab my other little remaining background chunk and sew it to the other side. And if you're making a bunch of blocks, you can come up with whatever, system, assembly line system you want. Since I'm only making one block here, there's like a million different ways that I can piece this thing together because there's not that many pieces. Okay, let's come back here. My corner pieces. I'm going to kickstart my iron and let's start pressing some seams. Now, you have probably heard quilters say press to the dark. That's a general rule. It doesn't always apply because it depends on the fabrics of the project or how many seams you have. Sometimes you have to press one row, all the seams going in the opposite direction, even though it might not be going to the dark fabric. So that's going to vary. But in this case, I'm going to press my patchwork pieces first just as they were sewn. I'll do it to all of them. And then I have brought up my handy dandy tailor's clapper, wooden tailor's clapper. If you don't have this, you need it. We have it in stock, okay? So Debbie's asking a good question. She says, do you recommend using a 1/4-inch presser foot? If you have the option on your machine like I do on this Juki LB5020 to scoot the needle over, you really don't need a 1/4-inch presser foot. And oftentimes I actually tell my students to not use the 1/4-inch foot because sometimes those 1/4-inch presser feet have like a hard guide. They have like a little metal thing that sticks out. And so it doesn't even let you go slightly bigger or slightly smaller. It just is like a true 1/4-inch. Well, if you're using thick thread, the thread itself has to be accounted for in the seam here. So when I press this back, and I have a video on YouTube where I go over like my tips for getting accurate 1/4-inch seams. And basically the trick is to sew a scant 1/4-inch. And scant means just like barely 1/4 of an inch. So when we're looking at the fabric, if you look really close, you know how you can see the threads, right? The weave of the fabric. I would say 2 or 3 threads less than 1/4 of an inch. Because what that's going to do is going to give you room to account for the thickness of the thread that you're using, which usually we use like a 50 weight cotton thread. If you're using a 40 weight cotton thread or even all-purpose polyester thread, your finished seam allowance will end up being bigger because we have to account for how thick is the thread. These are things that people don't even think about. But also when we fold it back, that bit of fabric that gets caught in the fold because the fabric needs to come this way and be pressed over. You know what I'm talking about? Like the little hump when you go to stitch in the ditch and something. This little bit there is taken up also in the seam because of the fold of the fabric to press it back to expose the pretty side. And so the thread and that little bit of fabric folded right there make up for like the 2 or 3 threads that you shied away from in the seam. And that's what helps you get a more accurate patchwork piece. If you sew a true 1/4-inch here, now you're adding a couple extra threads for or a couple extra threads wide of fabric, I would say, because of the thread itself plus the bit of fabric that's folded there. So in that video, and you can do a quick search on youtube.com, just type in Crafty Gemini 1/4-inch seams. You'll see it. And I go through and give you some exercises to do so that you can measure yours and figure out where on your machine you accurately want to set that scant 1/4-inch to get consistent patchwork blocks. You got to remember, the more seams you have in one block, the more any variance you have along each one of those seams is going to compound itself across the full row of blocks if you're making an entire quilt, okay? So a lot of times people get super duper frustrated and they're like, I'm using the 1/4-inch foot. And it's like, yeah, but you're eating up more at every seam as you go. So I prefer not to. Long answer to your question. So here I'm just going to press the seam, and I'm not pressing to the dark in this case. And it just works out that way here because the middle rectangle is bigger than this little bit. So it just, in my hands, it feels more comfortable and easier to press to the little chunk so it just sits flat. So notice I press it with the iron, and then I hit it with my tailor's clapper to cool, and ooh, beautifully flat. Let's go ahead and do the same thing to the other side. And I'm getting the tip of the iron all the way in that seam so I don't lose any fabric in the fold right there, okay? Set it with your clapper, and now we're gonna have that middle strip already done for the block, like that, okay? Let's go ahead and do the same thing to these ones. I do believe I had pressed these already, but this is gonna go here to make up the plus sign. So again, I'm gonna press it to the background fabric. Don't come for me if you're like, no, press to the dark. Neither one of these fabrics are super light or super dark. So sometimes, say if this was a white fabric and this was a black fabric, if you press to the white, oftentimes you'll see the black kind of shining through. And so a lot of times I think quilters do it because of that. You don't want the dark bits of a dark fabric shining through the seam allowance through a lighter fabric. But this is kind of medium, so it's not really going to matter too much. And sometimes I'm piecing a block together and then I realize, oh, once I get to like putting the different components of the finished block together, and then I realize, oh, I probably should have pressed the seams to the other way. And of course, if you go super short on your stitch length, you can press all your seams open, but for one little 6-inch block, it ain't that serious. All right, so now let's layer this back up. Here, here, and then our corner units. How cute is that? So now you see that these B and C components that we pieced together are now the same height as these. And this is where you will be easily able to see if you did not sew that scant 1/4 inch, because I have a seam in the middle of this unit and I don't have a seam here, which means that when this and this, they had to have been cut accurately individually. But then I also had to piece it together perfectly so that they do equal the same height as this. And oftentimes, if you have any little bit off, it's going to be in the seam allowance and you'll see it because you go to put these together and you're like, either you're like 1/8 of an inch short or it's too long. Then you know. If this is too short, I'll tell you, like if this middle unit here is too short and it doesn't measure the 2 3/4 of these side units, I'm going to tell you right now, you probably sewed a true 1/4 of an inch. And by the time the thickness of the thread came into play and the bit of fabric, now it's too short. Okay, so this is actually a great block for you to practice that with, and leave yourself a little post-it note on your sewing machine to know where the needle position needs to be in order to give you that perfect scant 1/4 inch, so that when it is pressed out and sewn to the nearby components on each side, it's accurate. Okay, so hopefully that helps. I'm going to go ahead and do this and this and this. So let's start stitching this up. Let me make some room here. Bring my sewing machine over. And notice I haven't used a pin yet. I don't need to. The pieces are small enough. All right. Remember, follow the guide. Do not look at the needle. I love when they match perfectly, don't you? So satisfying. Some people think, like, why would you do that to yourself? Make quilts where you have to cut precisely and then sew precisely. My favorite part is the cutting. I don't really care to piece 100 pieces of the exact same thing together. I like the cutting of the accuracy. And then I know my cutting was accurate when I go in to piece it, and then everything matches beautifully. Okay, so before I press, I'm going to make sure, here's this. If this is the top, I know that this goes to the top of the middle bar here to make my plus sign. So I know that the other background piece needs to go on the other side. And I'll stitch this up. Remember, if you want the free PDF page where I give you the cutting directions on how to make the little plus sign block in 3 different sizes, it's in 6, 9, and 12-inch finished blocks. This is a great little way to whip up a quilt in no time that's just made up of 1 block. A lot of practice here for you to cut some, squares and rectangles, as well as practice your accurate scant 1/4 inch seams, okay? That guy's done. And let's do this one to the other side. And we're almost done. I sometimes like to sew my patchwork blocks with the seams up so that I can keep them going, especially if it's really important that they keep going in a specific direction, so that I can see where they are and they don't kind of turn under on me under the presser foot while I'm sewing where I can't see them. Okay, let's press these guys and then stitch up the 3 rows to make up our block. So that middle guy is done. This one, again, I always press to set my stitches the same way that it was sewn. So I'm going to press on each side of these seams. Okay, now for this, I press the seams. Okay, let's look at this. This middle section goes in between the 2 other rows that I've pieced together just now. So here, the seam allowances are going out. If I want the seams to kind of match up top here, you'll see that I don't have to worry about pressing the seam allowances in because these seams don't match up with these side ones, okay? If this was a 4 patch or a true 9 patch block, then you know you have a bunch of seam intersections. So those of you that hate seam intersections might like this block because you don't really have that here, especially at the top to the middle rows, okay? So again, if you look, just by placing the patchwork units down like this, it's like it's telling me I want the seam allowances pressed to the outside. So that's what I'm going to do. I don't fight it too much, okay? Press, set with my clapper, let it cool for a sec. Same thing to the other side. Clapper is a game changer. If you ain't got a clapper, grab one. Oh, so pretty. Here. Let me give this a press. Look how cute that little block is going to be. And then, let's see. Diana's asking, she says, I'm planning to teach my Girl Scouts to sew. What tips do you have for novices? 1, sew on paper first. 2, watch the fabric, not the needle. Any others I might not remember to tell them? The number 1 thing for kids is make sure the presser foot is down. That's going to be their number 1 mistake. Whether or not they're looking at the needle or paper or not, every beginner forgets to put the presser foot down. That's like my biggest thing. And I can see it from across the room, you know, because the fabric is like swimming underneath the presser foot and you're like, no. Then they keep going and wondering why it's not sewing and they jam up the machine and you got to take out a huge nest of thread. That's the number 1. All right. So again, I'm going to press these seams to the outside. Set them with the clapper. My little block is almost done. A quilt like this would be so cute. To have like bright colors for the plus signs and then low volume background. So cute. And so fresh. And again, great for scrap busting if you're not planning to make the really big blocks, okay? For these 6-inch finished blocks, doesn't take much. Oh, how cute. This would even make like a cute pocket on the front of a toe. So you don't have to make full quilts each time, you know? You can practice your patchwork piecing techniques and stuff and then use them to embellish other more simple projects, right? Okay, so now, ta-da! Everything, again, if the pieces were cut accurately, the starch helps, I'm just saying, and you pieced it together accurately with a scant 1/4 inch and pressed everything nicely, everything should measure the same this direction because they need to match up for the next step of piecing, okay? So now I oriented the way it's supposed to look once it's finished, and I'm going to put one on top of the other, pretty sides touching, and again, I don't have any seam intersections because the plus sign is not like a true square, okay? So this makes it easy peasy. And I have wider seams up top. So see, even for this size chunk, I don't need pins because this is something that I can go slow enough to stay accurate and then just adjust it as I sew. And just stop and make sure, like whatever seams you have, if they need to be going in a specific direction underneath, just you can tell when it's bulky. And so just make sure that it's nice and smooth. If you feel a little bit of bulk, that means that one of the seam allowances may have moved on you underneath and you may need to, you know, flop it to the direction that it's supposed to be in before you continue sewing. Teresa says that Martelli mat has pressing and cutting in one. How long does it need to cool before you put the cutting mat back on? So it has like a little bit of a rubber thing back on here, and I literally put it right back on immediately, and I've never had an issue with it buckling or anything. Okay, so if that helps. So this is this. Let's go ahead and press it first. On the smaller blocks, I know that it can take more time to stop and press after each seam, but if I were to sew the other side to it, I can mistakenly press the seam that I'm gonna sew here in a crooked way, and I don't wanna do that. So I rather just piece this one, press this one, and then sew the other one once this is already flat. And so here, the seam allowance wants me to kind of press it that way. And the reason I say that is because this is one solid continuous piece of fabric, so there's no more seams here, versus pushing the seam allowance this way, I already have two more seams. So it's gonna be bulkier if I press it in this direction. Does that make sense? So I'm pressing there. And this is another thing. If you cut accurately and sew a scant 1/4 inch accurately, but you press inaccurately, you can still distort your block. So notice what I do. In the direction that I'm pressing the seam allowance, I lift up that side to the direction. So meaning I want the seam allowance to go here. I'm going to place the other chunk of the block down and run the tip of my iron in here because that's pushing all of the seam allowance in the direction that I want it to. So that makes me ensure that I don't have any fabric pinched or bubbled into that seam there. And that's where I get a lot of students. They'll say, well, everything was cut straight, but it's like wonky because there's like a little bit of fabric on one of the parts of the fold, and then on other bits of it, it's nice and straight. So you have to like push that fabric out of that fold, if that makes sense, okay? And then we need to sew this little bit down here. So cute. Okay, let me make sure that matches there. And I'm gonna sew from this side, and that's it. And then we're gonna measure it and see how accurate I was. Because after I sew this and press it, remember the pressing also matters. Oh, I think I got an extra bit of thread in there or something. It needs to measure 6.5 inches square. So that when it gets sewn to whatever, whether it's a border, some sashing, another quilt block, whatever it is, then that should take up an additional 1/4 inch seam around all 4 sides. And then that gives me the 6-inch finished block. All right, so let's see. Press it first as it was sewn. And then I'm going to press again in towards the middle block because that seam is longer and has less bulk. So again, like this, because this is where I want the seam to be pushed to the seam allowance. And then I press with the tip of my iron, push everything over so it's nice and flat. Grab my clapper and set it. Ta-da! I love pressing a good quilt block. Look how cute. So you see the high contrast? We said the gray was my light, and that aqua color fabric with polka dots is my dark. And that way the colors don't blend in together. That plus sign really pops out at me, the same as in this little block, even though they're different fabrics, both. And they're not even solids. They play as solids because of the contrast, right? But look how cute. Okay, so let's measure this one and see. I said it should measure 6.5 by 6.5, and it does. Of course it does, right? You got to follow those accuracy tips. So if I measure here and here, glare, glare. It's tricky to see too because of this, but let me put it on the yellow. I think it shows up better because of the lines. I don't want to put that big spotlight on y'all. But anyways, from here to here is 6.5, okay? You would measure in the middle, or if you have just like a big square ruler, you can just put it right on top and trim away any excess. But all that measures 6.5. I can turn it, and again, 6.5. So it's good. As long as I continue keeping my needle in the exact same position that it is here for sewing multiples of these together, whether to make a table run or a mini quilt or a bigger quilt, whatever it is, then I know that all the blocks will finish the same and I will be good to go. One thing to note about this block, because the middle bar, it's designed so that that middle bar goes horizontally next to you, it's still a square block. So you could technically turn them this way so that the middle bar is going vertically in front or vertically in the middle like this, and this one's going sideways. It's a cool way to play around with some secondary design elements based on the fabrics that you choose, right? If you choose the same fabric for all the sections of the plus sign, it's not going to matter too much. You're probably going to be the only one to know that you have vertical seams here versus horizontal seams here because it's still a square block. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Thank you, Gisela. She says, Vanessa's so cute. Thanks so much. Well, that is going to be it for today's demo. Remember that the Martelli mat that I'm using here has a cutting mat and an ironing board on it. We have a few left in stock. Super handy, really cool. And that way you don't have to be setting up a huge station for those of you with limited space. It is pricey, but it's totally worth it, especially if you do any type of multiple cuts and curved block piecing and stuff like that, because you can hold it down and cut as you go. Okay, the ruler that I used was my Crafty Gemini 5" by 10" ruler. And if you are just tuning in or you're tuning in late, make sure that you watch the beginning of this video where I go over why I designed this ruler and how it works with the black dot here at the 0 corner so that you can easily measure your fabric cuts and pieces in both directions. Okay, so that is in the online shop. The sewing machine, everything that I use today is in the online shop. And if you want to be kept in the loop about any upcoming demos, every WIP Wednesday, sales and classes and stuff like that, make sure that you head over to craftygemini.com. There's a little pop-up window and you can add your email address there so that we can add you to our free email newsletter. And that way we can keep you in the loop of everything that we have going on here at Crafty Gemini. All right? Thanks everybody for tuning in. I will see y'all next week for another episode of WIP Wednesday. Have a great weekend and hope you get to sew something.